Well, hey friends, it's really good to see you. Thank you for being a part of this fourth segment, this fourth conversation on race and unity. And as you know, we're having our conversation with an audience. So though we know each other well, let me go ahead and make some brief introductions, and then we'll jump into the topic at hand. So I'll go in my clockwise. So below me on the screen is Eddy Moratin. Eddy is a dear friend and a member of the board at Summit, and is the leader of Lift Orlando. And we're really working in our community to bring about development that is good for the city and good for communities in distress. Is really bridge building between across a lot of lines that have formerly divided people in our city. And so he's at the center of some good things happening in our city. And then Dr. Joel Hunter is maybe one of the most, certainly one of the most influential people in my life and in our church. And most of the good, memorable leadership things that have been said have come from his mouth and from his mind and his heart. And so Dr. Hunter, I really appreciate you being here. He heads up Community Resource Network, is the founder of that. And you can correct my summation, Joel, if this doesn't work, but CRN really works to bring together resources that are available in the community so that there's a multiplying effect that is good for people who are homeless and in distress in our city. And so there's a lot of good things happening, and you're helping connect the dots so that those good things happen to their fullness. And then Phil Hissom, also a long time, has had a long connection with Summit and been very influential in how we serve in our city and how we serve globally, as the founder of Polis Institute, and is at the front edge, the leading edge of both quality research and understanding issues in our city and sustainable, effective solutions for dealing with injustice. And so I appreciate all of you joining us in this conversation. In the next 35 minutes, I want us to be able to understand a bit the history of our city, some of the factors that have historical anchoring that have brought about present injustice, economically, racially, and otherwise in our city. For me, one of the most helpful things in caring, honestly, like caring to my core, that the church does good in areas of injustice in our city, was recognizing that we don't come to present day with a clean slate, a blank slate, as a city. There's a deep history here, and as I've begun to understand and unravel some of the history, I understand both the complexity of the challenges, the importance of the solutions, and honestly the hopefulness that there is in the present. And so maybe just to start us off, let's talk just a bit about some of the historical realities in our city. I remember the first time I heard that Division Street meant something, and it actually was the dividing line in our city between white community and Black community. And so that for me, like, was the beginning of kind of pulling the historical thread on our city. So tell us just a bit about what are some of the historical challenges that we face in the greater Orlando area.
I'll jump in just on that. It's been fascinating to understand the history of architects of decisions when it comes to like some of the big macro changes in society and broken systems that might be unjust. I feel like sometimes I am always on a hunt for like, yeah, but who was the person? Who was the person who actually suggested that line in the legislation, or who really advocated for voting for that decision to be made? And in that spirit, it's been interesting to learn about the person of James Buck Paramore, who came here after being a young widow, had fought in the Civil War, married the daughter of his superior officer. She died 10 years later without bearing any children. And kind of in the spirit of trying, like most of us do, moving to a new city to start anew, he comes to Orlando with his new bride after remarrying and 2 young children to build a future here. had aspired to get involved in real estate for a while, does so, and eventually becomes mayor in the late 1800s. He becomes, remains mayor for 6 full terms. Back then terms were 1 year. Is mayor through 1902. And, you know, when he passed, people describe him as being the most sort of dignified, this person that brought honor to the position and the office of the mayor. He led here in a time where Orlando was still just a little town. It was not a city at all. Our nickname back then was the Phenomenal City. This is before we were the City Beautiful. But it was that place that already then we were in a hurry to grow up. We were in a hurry to do something bigger than we were. But what was important about his contributions in the public eye was that he was the first to figure out how to get a real seriously well-organized fire department. To put in place, you know, stoplights, and to look at the aqueduct system and all these systems that lay the foundations for us to begin to move towards becoming a city. And he also conveniently jumped on the wave of southern cities segregating blacks to certain parts of their community and decided to move. We had well-established free blacks in Jonestown, in the area kind of where Boone High School is now. There were people where Reeves Terrace is today, but he was successful in saying and legislating pretty much that blacks had to live east of Division Avenue and west of Orange Blossom Trail. Was previously an industrial blue-collar neighborhood. And the police station was on Church Street and Division Avenue to watch that line and make sure that if you were black, you didn't cross it east after 6 o'clock and you couldn't live outside of that. And conveniently, that's also where Mr. Paramore owned most of his land. And so this was also a personally beneficial decision for him. But it's just interesting to me how he dies commemorated for all these great attributes. And yet the decisions he led really scarred our city till this day. You can find maps that show the demographic organization of where people live in Orlando. And the hard line that you see along downtown near I-4 between black and white population in Central Florida, man, well over 100 years later, it's crazy.
Yeah, and you can peel back the story a little further. And there's even, you know, I don't think it's fully sound history, but like there's you know, the rumor about even the family name and how it had developed over the generations before him in terms of the way that their slaves were treated. And so, yeah, you take this combination, like you said, this person who's kind of remembered in this glorified light, but as a person of the times, he was not sticking out. And I think that's one thing that I remind myself that however I think enlightened I think I might be, if I was white and lived at that time, I'd have and had some money and land, I would have been with the herd, you know, and that's a humbling thing. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, that's when we talk about like structural pressure, you know, we don't break from the herd very often, you know, and like back then it was just the way it was. And there were a few people, pioneers, but they were far and away the exception.
You know, you guys have been wonderful in studying the history specifically because you have a project in a specific area that has everything to do with the inheritance of a specific population in a specific area. But that area contains the DNA of the macro picture of the region and indeed of the state. Orlando there's jokes about Orlando that they say, you know, you have to go north to go south. In other words, you'd have to go to Georgia to really experience the South. But I don't think it's that easy. I think the structures of racism, the structures, as Phil says, that were characteristic of that era, deeply impacted Orlando. Orlando in the micro sense, or in the macro sense, kind of has a pre-Disney and a post-Disney era, pre-Disney. We've all seen the pictures of, this little town that's typical, but yet Southern town. I mean, but very family oriented. Post-Disney, it's still very family oriented. But what we don't see, and what I'm sure we'll get into, is that the divisions, both racial, ethnic, and economic divisions, were not cleared up by becoming the entertainment capital. As a matter of fact, they were exacerbated in that the service industry became, in some ways, a means of exploitation of unskilled labor. And so what we have is this history of, I think, a city that has a good heart, that really does want good relationships. They were doing as good as they could at the time. But as we look at it now, we've just inherited a lot of unhealthy and unhelpful systems. And so that it's going to take a lot of correction to really become the city beautiful.
Yeah, it's very well said.
Yeah.
It sure is. There's something about understanding that gets lost in most of us in everyday life.
Yeah. So how do we, there's an interesting documentary that was done on the first integrated Little League championship game, featuring an Orlando team and a I believe it was a Tallahassee team.
Pensacola.
Pardon? Oh,
Pensacola.
Yeah. And it's it's interesting when you hear the childhood recollections from team members from both teams. For the young men who are white, they talk about downtown Orlando, and like they could ride their bike anywhere. The world was open to them. There's the spirit of exploration and adventure, and you can contrast that with the African American team. And the limits and boundaries that were put on them on where they could go, how they could go, what it felt like to go exploring, and the realities of that. So many people, with how clearly the lines are drawn in our city, economically, racially, ethnically, like a person, and this would be me for a long time, could live most of your life without seriously crossing one of those lines in relationship or in life, and you could kind of live a life that's pretty disconnected from some of those historical realities. How would you, and that's probably part of the problem, maybe part of why some of those challenges still exist, but how would you encourage in a city that has a good heart, like you said, Dr. Hunter, but also still has a lot of these divisions? How do we address that in the present?
Well, one way is like an awareness that like the most segregated community in Orlando and in really America is the white community. So like we are the ones that have to kind of make that choice. We tend to be segregated off more. We've historically been able to choose that more, make those choices. Choices are opening up, but we're still choosing to kind of be with folks like us. And so you have to kind of move towards difference. And hopefully not just as someone with like, something to offer, just something, just a presence to be, like people to get to know, and some real friendships emerge. That's ideal. And, that comes up a lot in these kind of conversations, and people are like, how do I do that? Like, if I just go ask somebody if I could be their friend? Well, there's worse things you could ask somebody.
Well, I totally agree. When I first moved to Orlando, it was 1985, and the realtor that took us around as we were looking for our house, I said, I got in the car and said, look, I don't want to live in a white neighborhood. I want to live in a mixed neighborhood. And the realtor said, oh, we don't have any segregated neighborhoods here. We don't have any white neighborhoods. And I thought, well, that's great. That's really good to hear. But it wasn't true. And then, of course, I didn't start the church, but I took over a predominantly white congregation. I think we had one or two black folks and one or two Hispanics in the congregation. And again, started to experience, Martin Luther King's famous quip that 11 o'clock Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in our country. And so even when there wasn't intentional separation, there was default separation, as is perfectly understandable. But as Phil says, if you're going to have a multi-ethnic, multi-perspective, relationship experience, you've got to intend that, and you've got to take steps toward it. If you're a church, that calls for a strategy. If you're a person, that calls for a strategy. If you look at a system that is hurting people, that calls for a strategy in order to make things better. So it's not something that's you're never gonna fall into good change.
Right.
You just gotta think it through.
Yeah. So how do we approach that in our city? Where's the good change happening, maybe, is the question, and how do we participate in that?
I'll offer just a question. It's just a challenging question to ask. And I've offered it to friends who are white and comfortable and exist in a lot of very white and comfortable spaces. Next time you are in one of those spaces and you can't spot another person of color, ask yourself if you really believe that we're better when we're all together. Because deep down inside, you might actually be harboring beliefs that this is easier. This is they want to be over there, we want to be here. And those decisions were made by others to separate us when communities historically couldn't afford to say, I'm only going to live on this part of town or that part of town. People lived where they could find a home because they were all working in the same factory or in the same field. And for many communities, segregation was introduced by government investment. But we've gotten so accustomed to it that you can make yourself believe that it's better and easier when we're separate. When God shows us a beautiful picture of how much richer, more powerful, more amazing we are when we demonstrate his image in the diversity of people coming together, when we're listening and being patient and kind and forgiving of each other, because we have to, because we're all together. When we're separate, we can avoid some of those frictions, but we can start to believe that the lack of friction is actually good. So I think it starts by starting to question what we might already believe that's leading us down the wrong road.
Yeah, and I think it's building on like the really good things that are happening. Like I'm not known for like being Pollyannish at all. Probably other
what's about to happen right now?
People use for me, but that's not one of them. And so but when we look at the data, like we're actually low on the list of economic segregation in the country. One of our benefits is how fast we've grown. We've kind of hadn't had time some of the old northern cities had time to really entrench. So I think we have much more potential of continuing our interaction and healing and than some other cities do. I feel like we're really leading in the country in this idea of place-based philanthropy. It's not just Lift Orlando. Obviously, they're very key. You have Mr. Rosen down in Tangelo Park. People have said, here's a place, I'm going to commit to this. I'm going to support, and I'm going to build relationships. One of the most impressive things about Mr. Rosen to me is that 20 plus years, he's missed a couple of monthly meetings with residents. Here's a man who's really at this high level of success, very wealthy, and just shows up to meetings and build relationships with people. And like we do that in Orlando, we build partnerships, we work on stuff together. And again, I think we have organizations like Florida Citrus Sports has been right at the center of some of our color barrier breaking activities. I'm doing a study with their staff right now. It's actually Dignity Serves. It's something that Summit helped get off the ground years ago. And their staff is just so eager to be a part of changing the stadium story narrative. Across the country, stadiums are put in places where you can buy a big tract of land, leave it fallow for most of the time. Guess who lives there? It's people that are poor, people that are often non-white. And they're a part of Lift Orlando. They have their own history there, 70 years of serving. They've really focused on being a good neighbor there. I mean, and I could go on and on, but there's really good examples of like how and evidence that Orlando is a partnering, well-caring community that we can build on. I just think we've got some hurdles to get over in terms of racial piece. And I think the church is the best positioned group to help lead through that. I really do. And I really believe, and this is a genuine belief, that Orlando is going to show itself as someone who helped kind of bring kind of a leading role of bringing some of this healing. I really think that.
Amen. Amen.
I think so too. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is we really do have a very strong church community in Orlando. And historically, the changes that included the most compassion, the most humanity, the most inclusion has come from the church, especially the African American church, toward justice and equity. But the seeds are in the gospel. The seeds are in, every person being made in the image of God. All men are created equal. That's where it comes from. Loving your neighbors, you love yourself. So we're best positioned. And when Eddy asks the question, it's a really good question. Ask yourself, is it really better to include other people? There were two words that he used multiple times in his reflections. One was comfort, and one was better. One was ease, and one was better. And so the answer to the question is, it's way easier with people who are like I am. That's why we have so many echo chambers, and we're becoming a nation of bubbles right now. Just speak to people who believe what you believe, confirmation bias. But when you look at what we want for our children and our grandchildren, that's not what we want for them. We don't want ignorance. We don't want fear. We don't want just stagnation at the cost of conflict avoidance. We want for them what they're growing up in, being citizens of the globe, and that is ease and the easiness of understanding and the excitedness of including lots of different cultures, lots of different perspectives, being able to be friends with lots of different kinds of people. That's what I want for my grandchildren. And so that's what motivates me. It's just not that I'm an old guy who was in the civil rights movement 50 years ago. What motivates me is I want to build a better world, a more biblical picture of how the world should be, aligning ourselves with heaven for the sake of our kids.
Yeah, and that's me and my team have thousands and thousands of conversations and it's kind of positioned as surveys, but structured conversations in low-income communities. And I can tell you that what people say they want and what they're willing, it's not going to be that different in any community. The pathway to it is going to be different. But there's 5 things that bubble up, and they're always the top 5 in every community we've done these surveys in. And they rearrange depending on what's happening in the community, but it's safety, it's beauty, it's legacy. In other words, the next generation, what is really happening for our kids, respect, being looked at in the eye and treated with honest respect, and opportunity. People want genuine economic opportunity to build wealth for their family and to enjoy the fruits of their labor in a long and healthy life, like right out of Isaiah 65. Be the ones who plant and enjoy the food, and that's it's the kind of stuff we all want. That's what I want from my kids. It's like but I think the path forward is involves the church and really tapping into just the basics of the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
I reread Galatians this morning, and when he says it's for freedom that Christ has set you free, he's talking there about like, don't get bound back up in the law. Well, let's not get bound back up in our ideologies, or as Joel said, our bubbles. It's like it's detracting from the freedom we have in the gospel. Yeah. We're free to just go, I don't understand, but like let me sit here for a minute. We're free to like not say anything for a minute. And so we're free to do so many more things and be in relationship differently to really lead that way into healing. And I think it's just believing the word, pressing into it.
I know, John, you'll pull out a virtual hook and reel us in here if we start, but Phil's
talking about the Bible, we're going to get off on
yeah.
I just hit stop record when I'm done listening to you. Take over.
Just hit the done button.
That's right.
I do share that same optimism about the DNA of our community being so unique and distinctive for so many reasons. Like one of the untold stories I learned early on here, why this part of town was so different, why there was such a concentration of leaders here in West Lakes where we work around the stadium that were just incredible human beings. They were in the community by choice. And were all about rolling up their sleeves and building a better future, where many of them were the children of this amazing generation that established, the Washington Shores area, as this was sort of assumed part of for a long time as the greater Washington Shores, was built by this very rare collaboration of white and black leaders raising money to buy 50,000 acres between Clear Lake and Lake Man and established one of the first black suburbs in the country, where you had homestead where you could build homes, rent apartments, there were parks, schools, a hospital dedicated to African-American families, the first bank in the state of Florida, run by blacks, lending to blacks. I can go on. And that was happening in 1949 through the late 40s, early 50s. Like the Federal Housing Authority would publish articles promoting the Orlando plan. Now, it was still a separate but equal idea, right? Like it was allowed over here because back then from Orlando, that was like way across town. That was way over there. But the lesson that, we have a long history of being selfish with the benefits of this amazing country, with the great treasure of the American dream of mass upward mobility invented here. And at our best at times, even in the body of Christ, the closest we've come to his will is to think of ourselves as separate. I'll do mine here, you take of yours over there. But I think the reason we are not home yet is the invitation remains the same, that the only way we build great community is when we build shared community. That it's when we go beyond being selfish about what we have or even thinking separately about our destinies, but that God created us to be bound together. And that until we're sharing at the same table of life and of community, we won't experience all the benefits that community can offer, as close as we can get to that this side of heaven.
Yeah, it's really interesting. When the more I think about Jesus' prayer for us, that we would be unified, and the reality that the world would understand and know God better on the basis of our unity and love for each other. If I'm just thinking about it, I'm not sure I would have chosen that as the operative principle. And practically we don't actually live like we believe that. It's by our knowledge or by our good works or by our being right, and the fact that the bar was set at unity and love. And Phil, you're talking about how the church is really uniquely positioned to get us to the next level with seeing good happen in the world around us. Dr. Hunter, you talk about the importance of the gospel being the seedbed for us in that. Let's as we kind of in our last 5 minutes here, let's talk practically. The church charged to be and challenged and invited to be unified in Christ, so that the world will know God better and his kingdom be better fleshed out, the gospel being the seedbed, for change. And Phil, like you said, the church being at the center ought to be at the center for bringing justice in our city. What practical things in the next 5 years can churches of all ethnicities and traditions do to be a part of seeing good happen?
Let me hop right on this, John, and just say you're doing it right now. One of the main ones is to create conversations that will educate, that will include, that will empower people to have their own conversations. When you get right down to it, and this is our faith, it's all about relationships. I mean, there are some systemic things we need to address. There are policies we need to address as well. But nothing is going to be as important as building relationships with people who you love and you would defend, and you want the same for them that you want for, yourself. And so this kind of conversation that goes before the church, and the conversation that we're starting to organize at the Justice Leaders Network, where it'll probably be 350 people on a Zoom call with the church, with the African American church, talking with the predominantly white church, with the title is An Honest Conversation, mm-hmm. where we face the unfulfilled parts of the gospel, and we talk about where there needs to be repentance, and where there needs to be lament, and where there needs to be reconciliation and reconstruction, and so on and so forth. So I think that a lot of people who are either in the pews or now, as we worship on Zoom, in collected congregations, want to say, well, what can I do? And I think this kind of conversation is most valuable, because they can start conversations in their families, with their friends, and that opens up then a lot of possibilities of improvement.
Yeah, I'd say that the church is, it's different substantially and substantively from another nonprofit, mm-hmm. kind of nonprofit. We are, by and large, trying to help people connect to and build relationships with Christ, right? So, like when we are sending volunteers places, they can have a different charge, because what's our metric? Nonprofits have a mission. They're trying to prove certain things, so they can't be as patient as we can be in some ways. If they're trying to improve academic test scores for a child, the church can be there and just say, what's more important is the relationship with that family. So I think churches practically can commit to things, and some of the ways that Summit's doing, working with, picking very specific things for long-term commitment, places, issues, and focusing on the relationships that are built there. Other outcomes are important for sure, but that's something unique the church can do, mm-hmm. because people are just asking, how do I live out my faith? Mm-hmm. They're not just showing up for a volunteer opportunity in a nonprofit. It's like they're advancing the kingdom in big and small ways, and the church provides that kind of direction to say, the value of us committing and thinking about this over 10, 20 years, not just like an event, is going to change the world. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's yeah.
You have the final minute to bring it all home, tie it all together, my friend.
Yeah, go Eddy. Woo!
No pressure.
Well, I listened to these two amazing guys, and I just keep seeing the face of Jesus, and I wonder if, given the choice between preserving the status quo, my religious community's posture and conservative ideas, or risking the scandal of being the advocate for the outsider, or being seen as one who heralds the weak, I think I know what Jesus would choose every single time. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that is at risk now is, will the church be heard with an even louder voice about what is right and what honors God, or risk having their position usurped by those whose agenda may not be love, may not be peace, may not be the betterment of our future, we really need to take a serious stock of what's at stake.
Amen. He did it.
He did. I know. Well done.
Well,
I'll resist the urge to do anything other than thank you for being a part of this conversation. And there will be discussion groups following for folks. And so you've set the stage well for continued conversation. I think that's our big takeaway. Orlando has a history, and the history has some really beautiful elements, some really challenging elements. There's good things happening, and our role in this is not to fix problems in the absence of relationship, but to build relationships, and through those be a part of gospel, God honoring solutions. All right, thank you all. Have a good rest of the day.
Thank you.
Take care.